At 11:47 p.m. on Christmas Eve, my husband was popping champagne with his mistress in her penthouse. At that exact moment, our 6-year-old son stopped breathing in my arms, and every single EpiPen in our home was empty. For 3 years, I thought I had a careless husband. I was wrong. I had a monster who'd been tampering with our son's medication to frame me as an unfit mother, all to steal my $4.2 million trust fund. But Derek made one fatal mistake. He forgot that my father is a federal judge. And what happened next? Let's just say the courtroom became his prison. If this satisfies your soul, hit subscribe. You'll want to hear every word of this. Christmas Eve had always been my favorite night of the year. The smell of sugar cookies baking, carols playing softly, and my 6-year-old son Ethan decorating gingerbread men with more frosting than coordination. Mommy, look, this one has 100 sprinkles. Ethan held up his masterpiece. Green frosting smeared across his cheek. I laughed and kissed his forehead. That's the most beautiful cookie I've ever seen. My phone buzzed. A text from Derek: emergency meeting with Tokyo investors. Don't wait up. Sorry, baby. I sighed, another missed holiday, another empty chair at dinner. But I pushed down my disappointment and focused on Ethan's joy. Around 8 o'clock, the doorbell rang. A delivery driver handed me an elegant gift basket wrapped in gold ribbon. No card, just a tag reading Merry Christmas to the Mercer family. Look, mommy cookies. Ethan pointed at the assortment inside. I examined the basket: gourmet chocolates, fancy crackers, and decorated sugar cookies, probably from one of Derek's business associates. I set it on the counter while I finished cleaning up our baking mess. That's when it happened. I turned around to find Ethan chewing one of the cookies from the basket, crumbs falling down his pajama shirt. My blood ran cold. Ethan, stop, let me see that cookie. I grabbed the basket and frantically read the ingredient label. Peanut flour. Contains tree nuts. Mommy, my tongue feels funny, Ethan said. His lips were already swelling. Red hives bloomed across his neck. My son was severely allergic to peanuts. One exposure could kill him. I ran to the kitchen drawer where we kept his EpiPens. My hands shook as I grabbed the first one. Empty. I grabbed the second. Also empty. The third, which I always kept fully loaded, had an expiration date from 18 months ago. Mommy, I can't breathe good. Ethan's voice came out as a wheeze. His face was turning red, then pale. I could hear the stridor in his breathing, that terrifying high-pitched sound of airways closing. I dialed 911 with one hand while scooping Ethan up with the other. My son is in anaphylactic shock. I need an ambulance now. But I couldn't wait. The nearest hospital was 12 minutes away. An ambulance would take at least 6 to arrive. I ran to the car, Ethan limp in my arms. His lips were turning blue. I called Derek as I drove, running every red light. Voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. 7 times I called while my son gasped for air in the back seat. Stay with me, baby. Mommy's getting you help. Stay with me. I performed rescue breathing at every red light, tilting his head back, forcing air into his closing throat. I was a pediatric nurse before I gave up my career. Those skills were the only thing keeping my son alive. We screeched into the emergency bay at Boston General. I carried Ethan through the doors, screaming for help. Nurses rushed toward us. Someone took him from my arms. Then I collapsed. The next 3 hours were a blur of fluorescent lights, doctors shouting orders, and the relentless beeping of monitors. I sat in the waiting room, Ethan's dried frosting still on my sweater, and prayed to a God I wasn't sure was listening. Finally, Dr. Catherine Pierce emerged. Mrs. Mercer, your son is stable. We got the epinephrine into him just in time. She paused. Another 2 minutes and we would have lost him. I sobbed with relief. You can see him now. He's asking for you. Ethan looked so small in that hospital bed, oxygen mask over his face, IV in his tiny arm. But he was alive. He was breathing. Mommy, he whispered. I'm sorry I ate the cookie. I held his hand and cried. It's not your fault, baby. It's not your fault. At 2:17 in the morning, Derek finally arrived. He rushed into the room, still wearing his expensive suit, face arranged in perfect concern. Oh God, Caroline, I just got your messages. My phone was on silent for the meeting. Is he okay? Is our boy okay? He pushed past me to Ethan's bedside, stroking our son's hair, whispering comforting words, the image of a devoted father. But when he leaned down to kiss Ethan's forehead, I saw it, a smear of lipstick on his collar, deep red, the color of Cabernet, the same shade I'd seen in magazine ads, the shade I never wore. He kissed Ethan's forehead and whispered, "Daddy's here now." But when he pulled back, that lipstick stain caught the fluorescent light, red as betrayal, red as the roses he'd stopped buying me 2 years ago. I said nothing. I filed it away in my mind alongside the empty EpiPens and the 7 unanswered calls. Something was very wrong with my marriage, and I was beginning to suspect it might be something far worse than a wandering eye. The next 3 days, Derek performed the role of devoted father with theatrical precision. He slept in the chair beside Ethan's bed when nurses were watching. He ordered gourmet meals delivered to my stressed self, making sure the staff saw his thoughtfulness. He called his mother Eleanor, speaking loudly about postponing important meetings because family comes first. But I watched, and I noticed. At 3 in the morning on the second night, I woke to find Derek's chair empty. I found him in his hallway, face illuminated by his phone screen, thumbs flying across the keyboard. He was smiling. "Who are you texting?" I asked. He startled. "Just work. The Tokyo deal is falling apart without me." At 3 a.m. Time zones. "Caroline," his voice carried that patient, patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "Go back to sleep. You look exhausted of dad." I returned to Ethan's room but didn't sleep. On day 3, a local news crew showed up to cover the Christmas Eve miracle of a child saved by his quick-thinking mother. Derek positioned himself beside Ethan's bed, hand on our son's shoulder, before I could object. "We're just grateful our boy is okay," Derek told the camera, voice cracking with practice-stored emotion. "Caroline is an amazing mother. I don't know what I would have done if I'd lost them." The moment the camera turned off, Derek checked his watch. "I have to run. Board meeting I absolutely cannot miss." He kissed Ethan's forehead for the audience of nurses and was gone. 20 minutes later, my father arrived. Judge Harrison Ashford commanded attention without trying. 63 years old, silver-haired, with eyes that had seen 3 decades of criminals try to lie their way to freedom. He missed nothing. "Papa?" Ethan's face lit up. My father's stern expression melted instantly. He sat on the bed and let Ethan show him every tube and wire, explaining each one with 6-year-old importance. After Ethan fell asleep, my father turned to me. His expression had shifted to something I couldn't quite read. "Where was Derek when it happened?" he asked. "Business meeting. Tokyo investors. On Christmas Eve. The time difference. Caroline." My father's voice was gentle but firm. "I've been a judge for 28 years. I know when someone is reciting a prepared answer." I felt tears threatening. "Dad, I also know that Derek's company hasn't done business with any Japanese firms in over 2 years." I checked. The words hit me like cold water. "You checked." My father took my hands. His grip was warm, steady, the same hands that had held mine at my mother's funeral 5 years ago. "I've had concerns about your husband for some time. I didn't want to interfere without cause. But after this," he glanced at Ethan's sleeping form. "When you're ready, come to the house. We need to talk." "About what?" His jaw tightened. "About where Derek really was while his son was dying." He stayed another hour, reading to Ethan when he woke, bringing genuine smiles to my son's face. When he left, he hugged me longer than usual. "Trust your instincts, baby girl. They've been trying to tell you something for a long time." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Derek's face when the camera was on versus off. The concerned husband who materialized for audiences and vanished when none were watching. I kept remembering the lipstick on his collar, the empty EpiPens that should have been full, the 7 unanswered calls. My father hadn't looked at Derek like that since the day we announced our engagement. Back then, I thought it was overprotective instinct, the loving father who didn't think any man was good enough for his daughter. Now, watching Derek wave goodbye with that practiced smile, I wondered what my father had seen that I'd been too in love to notice. 5 days after Christmas, I drove to my father's Beacon Hill townhouse with shaking hands. Ethan was safely home, watched by a new nanny I'd hired without telling Derek. Someone with no connection to the Mercer family. Someone I could trust. My father met me at the door. His face was grave. Come to my study. The room smelled of leather and old books, just like my childhood. But today it felt different, colder. A manila envelope sat on his mahogany desk. Sit down, Caroline. I sat. 6 months ago, I noticed inconsistencies in Derek's behavior. Late meetings that didn't match his calendar. Cash withdrawals he couldn't explain to you. The way his stories never quite added up. He pushed the envelope toward me. I hired a private investigator. I prayed I was wrong. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Photographs spilled across the desk. Derek and a blonde woman at an upscale restaurant. Her hand on his lips at her ear. Timestamp October 14th, 8:23 p.m. the night Derek told me he was visiting his sick mother in Connecticut. Derek and the same woman entering a penthouse building. Timestamp November 28th, 6:45 p.m. Thanksgiving, when he'd claimed to be stuck at the airport. Derek and the woman kissing on a balcony. Champagne glasses in hand, city lights sparkling behind them. Timestamp of December 24th, 11:47 p.m. Christmas Eve. While Ethan was turning blue in my arms. Her name is Vanessa Thornton Bremo, my father said quietly. She's a paralegal at a firm Derek's company uses. They've been together for approximately 2 years. 2 years? Our entire marriage was a lie. There's more. He handed me a second set of documents, bank statements. In the past 24 months, $890,000 has disappeared from your joint accounts. Derek claiming they were investments. They weren't. The money went to offshore accounts and cash withdrawals. I stared at the numbers, unable to process them. And this, my father's voice hardened, this is what convinced me to show you everything. A credit card statement, jewelry purchases, expensive dinners, hotel suites, all things I'd never received or enjoyed, and one charge highlighted in yellow. December 23rd, gourmet gift baskets unlimited, $127. The basket, I whispered. The cookies that almost killed Ethan, paid for with Derek's credit card, delivered to your home, addressed to your family. The room spun. I gripped the armrests. He knew about the peanuts. He knows about Ethan's allergy. Why would he, Caroline? My father knelt beside me, taking my hands. I don't think Derek wanted Ethan to die. I think he wanted Ethan hospitalized. I think he wanted everyone to see that his wife, the former nurse, couldn't properly manage their son's medical condition. What? Why would he? Because he's building a custody case against you. My investigator found records of Derek consulting a divorce attorney 8 months ago. The strategy outlined in those documents is clear. Document the mother's negligence. Establish pattern of medical mismanagement. Gain full custody. Custody, Derek doesn't even like being around Ethan. No. But Ethan has a trust fund, $4.2 million from your grandmother, held in trust until he's 25 or accessible to his custodial parent for care expenses if the other parent is deemed unfit. Everything clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The way Derek had encouraged me to quit nursing, the way he'd insisted on handling Ethan's medications, the way every EpiPen had been empty or expired. Dad, I whispered. He was going to frame me for our son's death. Take my money, Ethan's money, and walk away clean. My father's jaw tightened. Yes, that's exactly what he planned. What do I do? He stood, walked to his desk, and pressed an intercom button. Send them in. The door opened. 3 people entered: a sharp-eyed woman in a designer suit, a stern man with wire-rimmed glasses, and a middle-aged woman with a detective's badge visible on her belt. Caroline, this is Victoria Holbrook, the best family attorney in Massachusetts, Thomas Bennett, forensic accountant, and Rachel Montgomery, private investigator. My father's voice carried steel I'd never heard before. We're going to destroy him, legally, financially, completely. And when we're done, Derek Mercer will have nothing left. Not his money, not his reputation, not his freedom, and not my grandson, my father added quietly. Never again. The war room took shape within hours. Thomas Bennett spread financial documents across every surface of my father's study, while Rachel Montgomery pinned photographs to a corkboard that covered an entire wall. Victoria Holbrook paced the length of the room, legal pad in hand, already building the architecture of our case. I sat in a leather chair by the window, watching these strangers dissect my marriage with surgical precision. Every document they examined was another piece of my life revealed as a lie. Every photograph was another moment of betrayal frozen in time. Let's start with what we know, Victoria said, her voice crisp and professional. Derek Mercer has been systematically draining your joint assets for approximately 2 years, but the financial crimes are just the surface layer. Thomas Bennett adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and pulled up a spreadsheet on his laptop. I've traced the $890,000 to three primary destinations. $200,000 moved to an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands under a shell company called Pacific Ventures LLC. Derek mentioned Pacific Ventures, he said, my voice hollow. He said it was a real estate investment. Said we'd double our money in 5 years. The company exists only on paper. No employees, no assets, no actual business operations. Thomas shook his head. $340,000 went to cash withdrawals at various gambling establishments, Atlantic City, Foxwoods, a private high-stakes club in Manhattan. Gambling. The word felt foreign in my mouth. Derek had always been so controlled, so calculated. I never saw any signs addicts or experts at hiding their compulsions. Victoria interjected. Especially addicts with resources and intelligence. Your husband is both, Thomas continued, his voice grim. But here's where the situation becomes significantly more serious. 6 months ago, Derek took out a personal loan for $2.8 million. The collateral listed on the loan application was property he doesn't legally own. What property? Your grandmother's estate in Cape Cod, the waterfront home, and 12 acres held in trust for Ethan. My blood ran cold. That house was where my mother had spent her summers as a child, where I'd learned to swim, where Ethan had taken his first steps on the beach. It was supposed to be his legacy, the one thing Derek couldn't touch. He forged your signature on the collateral documents, Thomas said, sliding a paper across the table. This is your purported authorization. That's not your signature, Mrs. Mercer, but it's a very good forgery. I stared at the loops and curves that looked almost like my handwriting. Almost, but not quite. The woman who'd signed this document was a fiction, a character Derek had invented to steal from his own son. Victoria leaned forward, her expression intense. This constitutes federal wire fraud. The transactions crossed state lines and utilized electronic banking systems. We're not talking about divorce court anymore. Caroline, we're talking about federal criminal charges. Years in prison. For a moment, I felt a spark of hope. Then Rachel Montgomery spoke, and that hope turned to ash. The financial crimes are damning, Rachel said, but they're not what keeps me up at night. She pulled photographs from her folder, not images of Derek and Vanessa this time, but documents, medical records, pharmacy logs, hospital incident reports. I obtained Ethan's complete medical file going back 2 years. I have contacts at the hospital who owed me favors. She spread the documents across the table. Something in the pattern caught my attention immediately. She laid 3 incident reports side by side, each one highlighted with yellow marker. September 15th, Ethan had a mild allergic reaction at school after eating a snack from home. The EpiPen administered by the school nurse was noted as partially effective, unusual for properly stored medication. He recovered, but the nurse documented her concerns. I remember that day, I whispered. Derek picked him up from school. He said everything was fine, just a minor reaction. November 8th, another reaction, this time at home during dinner, more severe than the first. The EpiPen you administered was again noted as suboptimal response. Ethan required emergency room treatment. I remembered the terror of that night, Ethan's swollen face, the race to the hospital, Derek arriving an hour late with apologies about traffic. December 24th, near-fatal anaphylaxis. All EpiPens found in the home were empty or expired. Rachel looked at me, her expression a mixture of professional detachment and genuine sympathy. Do you see the pattern? Caroline, escalation, I whispered. Exactly. Someone has been systematically tampering with Ethan's emergency medication over a period of months, creating a documented history of increasingly serious medical emergencies that occurred under the mother's care. Rachel's voice was flat with controlled fury. The reactions got worse each time because whoever did this was testing, calibrating, seeing exactly how far they could push before it became fatal. Victoria took over, her lawyer's mind connecting the dots. We cross-referenced pharmacy records with hospital documentation. You picked up Ethan's prescriptions on schedule, every single time, fresh EpiPens, properly stored, correctly labeled. But the medications that ended up being used in your home were compromised. Someone switched them, I said. The words felt unreal, like I was describing a plot from a crime novel, not my own life. Someone with regular access to your house, someone who knew Ethan's medication schedule intimately, someone who had reason to want documented proof of your negligence as a mother. Rachel paused. Someone who would benefit from you being declared an unfit parent. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, horrifying. He wasn't just going to divorce me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He was going to hospitalize our son, maybe kill him, frame me for medical neglect, take custody, drain Ethan's trust fund to pay his gambling debts, and walk away clean while I faced criminal charges for child endangerment. That's our assessment, yes, Victoria confirmed. And Christmas Eve was supposed to be the final act, the near-fatal reaction that would prove once and for all that Caroline Mercer couldn't be trusted with her own son's life. There's one more thing, Thomas said reluctantly. He slid another file across the table. Inside was a photograph of a beautiful dark-haired woman with haunted eyes. Natalie Crawford. Derek was engaged to her 6 years ago, 3 years before he met you. What happened to her? Within 18 months of their engagement, she'd lost $340,000 to investment opportunities Derek recommended. Sound familiar? Rachel's voice was bitter. When she tried to press charges, Eleanor Mercer intervened. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses suddenly couldn't remember anything. Natalie's family received threats they couldn't trace but understood perfectly. Where is she now? Seattle, living under a different name, still terrified after 6 years. Rachel met my eyes. You're not his first victim. Caroline or Artu, you're just the first one with a father powerful enough to fight back. I looked at the evidence spread across my father's study. The photographs of betrayal, the forged documents, the medical records documenting my son's systematic poisoning, the file on a woman whose life Derek had destroyed before he ever met me. This wasn't a husband who'd made mistakes. This wasn't a marriage that had simply failed. This was a predator who'd selected me as his target, married me for access to wealth, and spent 3 years positioning himself to destroy me completely. What do we do now? I asked. Victoria's smile was cold, predatory, and deeply satisfying. Now we set a trap, and your husband is going to walk right into it. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Victoria arranged a mediation meeting to discuss Ethan's post-hospital care arrangements. The premise: I was overwhelmed, struggling to manage his complex medical needs alone, and wanted to discuss shared responsibilities going forward. Derek agreed immediately. Of course he did. This was exactly what he'd been working toward for months documented. Witness proof that Caroline Mercer couldn't handle the basic responsibilities of motherhood. I could almost hear his satisfaction through the phone when Victoria's office called to schedule. Another step toward his goal, another brick in the case he was building against me. He had no idea he was walking into a trap. The morning of the meeting, I practiced my lines in the bathroom mirror. Scared wife, overwhelmed mother, woman on the verge of emotional collapse. It wasn't entirely acting. The fear was real fear that he would see through me, that my anger would slip past my control, that I would look into his lying eyes and scream the truth at him before we had the evidence we needed. Remember, Swayam, Victoria had coached me during our preparation session. You're not trying to convince him of anything new. He already believes you're weak and incompetent. You're simply confirming his existing assumptions about who you are. What if I can't do it? What if he sees through me? He won't. Victoria's voice was certain. Men like Derek don't see women as complex individuals with hidden depths. They see what they want to see, what serves their narrative. You've been playing a role for 3 years without realizing it. Now you're just playing it consciously. The conference room at Victoria's law firm occupied a corner of the 32nd floor, designed to project power and intimidate opponents. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Boston Harbor. A mahogany table that could seat 20 dominated the space. Abstract art worth more than most people's annual salaries hung on the walls. Derek arrived 5 minutes early, wearing his most expensive charcoal suit and his most charming smile. His attorney, a junior associate from Eleanor's preferred firm, who looked barely old enough to have passed the bar exam, trailed behind him like a nervous shadow. Caroline, Derek crossed the room in 3 strides, arms open for an embrace that made my skin crawl. I'm so glad you reached out. I've been worried about you. You've seemed so fragile since Christmas. His cologne was expensive. His concern was manufactured. His hands on my shoulders felt like the touch of something cold and dead. I endured the embrace and stepped back, keeping my eyes downcast. Submissive. Broken. I can't do this alone anymore. Derek. I let my voice crack with practiced vulnerability. After what happened on Christmas Eve, I lie awake every night terrified I'll make another mistake, that I'll miss something important, that I'll fail Ethan when he needs me most. Of course, sweetheart. Of course! Derek guided me to a chair with exaggerated gentleness, every gesture calculated for the audience. That's exactly why we're here, to figure this out together, to make sure our son is safe and cared for. His use of "our son" almost made me laugh. The man who tried to poison that son for insurance money now playing the devoted father. Victoria slid a document across the polished table, her expression carefully neutral. We've drafted an interim agreement regarding Ethan's medical management. Given recent events, it seems prudent to clearly delineate responsibilities and expectations. Derek's attorney reached for the document, but Derek waved him off with casual arrogance. The young man's frown suggested he knew this was a mistake, but he wasn't senior enough to contradict his client. I'm sure it's fine. Victoria is a reasonable woman. Derek skimmed the pages without really reading them, just scanning for the signature line, eager to claim his victory. This says I'll take primary responsibility for Ethan's medication protocol going forward. Prescription management, storage, emergency supplies, administration schedules the works. Is that acceptable? Victoria asked, her voice betraying nothing. More than acceptable. It's exactly what I've been suggesting for months. Derek pulled his Mont Blanc pen from his jacket pocket with a flourish, the same pen he had used to sign our marriage license. I realized with a jolt of bitter irony. Caroline needs support. She's been struggling ever since her mother passed away. Grief can be so destabilizing. You know. He shook his head with practiced sympathy. I'm just relieved she's finally admitting she needs help. He signed his name with confident, flowing strokes. Bold, decisive, incriminating. For the record, Victoria said calmly, her eyes fixed on Derek's face. You're acknowledging that you, Derek Harrison Mercer, will be personally responsible for maintaining Ethan's emergency medical supplies going forward. The procurement, the storage, the rotation of stock, the verification of expiration dates, all of it falls under your oversight. Absolutely, 100%. Derek smiled at me, patronizing, triumphant, insufferable, the smile of a man who believed he'd already won. Don't worry, baby. Daddy's got this handled now. You can finally relax. The moment his pen left the paper, something shifted in the room. A change in pressure, like the air before a storm. Victoria's posture straightened almost imperceptibly. A small, satisfied smile crossed her face there and gone in an instant. But I caught it. Derek caught it too. His expression flickered, the slightest uncertainty crossing his handsome features. Helpful for what? Exactly. For establishing your personal knowledge of and legal responsibility for Ethan's medical needs. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. Should any questions arise regarding past incidents or future complications? Derek's attorney sat forward, suddenly alert. I'm sorry, what past incidents are you referring to? This was supposed to be a simple care coordination meeting. I think we're finished here. Victoria stood, gathering her materials with crisp efficiency. Thank you both for your time and cooperation. I watched Derek's face as he processed what had just happened. The confusion, the first flicker of suspicion, the dawning realization that he might have made a mistake. But he didn't understand yet. Not fully. He couldn't imagine that his weak, fragile, overwhelmed wife had set him up. That the document he had just signed would be Exhibit A in his own prosecution. That evening, my father opened champagne in his study. Victoria, Thomas, and Rachel raised their glasses alongside us, the warm light of his desk lamp casting golden shadows across their faces. He just signed a document explicitly accepting responsibility for Ethan's medication management, Victoria announced, satisfaction evident in her voice. When we present evidence of the tampered EpiPen's evidence showing deliberate, systematic sabotage over a period of months, he won't be able to claim ignorance. He won't be able to blame you. He personally acknowledged complete oversight and responsibility. In writing, witnessed, and recorded. She nodded toward the decorative antique clock on the bookshelf. Hidden inside its mahogany casing was a camera that had captured every moment of the meeting. "We have him," she said, "on paper and on video." "To justice," my father toasted, his voice thick with emotion. The crystal glasses clinked. For the first time since Christmas Eve, I felt something other than despair. Something like hope. Something like power. I didn't know that 3 blocks away, in Eleanor Mercer's Beacon Hill penthouse, a very different meeting was taking place. A meeting that would bring everything crashing down within 72 hours. 3 days after our victory in the conference room, Eleanor Mercer came to my father's house. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd stopped by to pick up documents Victoria needed for the next phase of our strategy and was waiting in the kitchen when the doorbell echoed through the townhouse, through the crack in the door. I watched my father's housekeeper escort Eleanor Mercer into the marble-floored foyer. She moved like a woman who owned the world and everyone in it. Designer suit in charcoal gray, perfect silver hair swept back from a face that had been beautiful once and was now merely formidable. Diamond earrings that caught the light with every step. The kind of cold, polished elegance that came from 6 decades of getting exactly what she wanted. I'd always been intimidated by my mother-in-law, her sharp eyes that seemed to be everything, her cutting remarks disguised as compliments. The way she looked at me like I was a temporary inconvenience in her son's life, something to be tolerated until he moved on to better options. Now I understood that my instincts had been right all along. "Harrison," her voice carried through the hallway, cultured, controlled, venomous. "We need to speak privately about your daughter's unfortunate choices regarding my son." My father's response was ice. "What else do you have to say, Eleanor? You can say to Caroline directly. I'll call her down." "I don't think so." The click of her heels on marble stopped. "This conversation is between you and me, about your future, and whether you'll have one worth living after I'm finished." I crept to the study door, which stood slightly ajar. My heart hammered against my ribs so loudly I was certain they could hear it. Through the gap, I watched Eleanor settle into one of my father's leather chairs like she owned it. She crossed her legs, folded her hands in her lap, and smiled the smile of a woman holding all the cards. "15 years ago, she began, you presided over a case involving Mercer Holdings, a disgruntled former employee, a whistleblower. As the press called him alleged financial misconduct and securities fraud, you dismissed the case for insufficient evidence." I remember the case well, but the evidence was insufficient to proceed. That was the correct legal determination. "Perhaps," Eleanor's smile widened, "but the timing was interesting. Wasn't it the same week you dismissed that case? Your re-election campaign received a $50,000 donation from a company called Coastal Investments, LLC. Silence fell over the study like a shroud. "That donation was completely legal," my father said finally. "Campaign contributions are public record. Everything was filed properly with the Federal Election Commission." "Legal, yes, but appearances matter tremendously in your profession, don't they?" Eleanor's voice was silk wrapped around a razor blade. "Imagine the headline, 'Federal Judge Accepts Mercer Money, Dismisses Mercer Case.' Even if nothing criminal occurred, and we both know nothing criminal occurred, an investigation would destroy you. Your reputation, your legacy, your ability to protect your precious grandson. What do you want, Eleanor? What any mother wants, to protect her child." She uncrossed her legs, leaned forward. "Call off your end this absurd investigation into Derek. Let Caroline file for a quiet divorce with standard terms, reasonable alimony, shared custody. Everyone walks away with their dignity intact. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning, every news outlet in Boston receives documentation suggesting a sitting federal judge was bought and paid for by the very family now suing him. Eleanor's eyes glittered with cold satisfaction. Your career ends in disgrace. Your pension is forfeit, and any evidence you've gathered against Derek becomes fruit of the poison tree tainted by a corrupt judge with an obvious personal vendetta. The silence stretched so long I thought I might scream just to break it. Then my father spoke, and his voice was heavy with something I'd never heard before. Defeat. I need time to consider your proposal. 24 hours. After that, the documents go to the press. All of them. And your granddaughter will grow up knowing that her grandfather was a corrupt judge who took bribes from criminals. I pressed myself against the wall as Eleanor swept past the doorway. Her perfume lingered in the hallway, expensive, cloying, suffocating. The smell of a predator marking her territory. When I entered the study, my father was standing at the window with his back to me. His shoulders were slumped. His hands hung loose at his sides. He looked suddenly old in a way I'd never seen before, not even at my mother's funeral. You heard, he said without turning around. Yes, I can't fight for you anymore, baby girl. His voice cracked slightly, and I heard decades of strength begin to crumble. If I continue, she'll destroy me. And if she destroys me, I can't protect Ethan at all. No influence, no connections, no resources. I'll be a disgraced former judge with nothing to offer but shame. Dad, there has to be another way. There's always another way. There isn't. He turned and I saw tears on his weathered cheeks. The first tears I'd witnessed from him since the day they lowered my mother into the ground. I've spent my entire career putting away criminals. 30 years on the bench, thousands of cases, and now a single woman walks into my home and defeats me without breaking a sweat. The donation wasn't a bribe. You know that. I know that. What I know doesn't matter. What can be proven doesn't matter. He sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. What matters is what can be made to look true, and Eleanor Mercer has spent 50 years learning how to make truth irrelevant. Victoria called an hour later. Her voice was clipped, professional, but I could hear the frustration beneath. I'm withdrawing from the case. Caroline, effective immediately. What, Victoria, you can't. Word has already spread through Boston's legal community. Representing you means crossing Eleanor Mercer. That means career suicide. I have partners to answer to, associates whose futures I'm responsible for. She paused. I'm sorry, I thought I was strong enough to see this through. I was wrong. By midnight, my entire team had evaporated. Thomas Bennett apologized profusely over a brief phone call. I have a family to think about. A daughter starting college next year. I can't risk. I'm sorry. Carolyn, I truly am. Rachel Montgomery simply stopped answering her phone. I sat alone in my father's study, surrounded by evidence no one would touch. The photographs, the documents, the medical records, the carefully constructed case that had been our weapon was now just paper. Dead weight, useless. Maybe you've been there, but maybe you've had that moment when everyone you counted on disappeared, when the people who promised to help suddenly remembered they had other obligations, when you realized that you were truly, completely alone. If you have, you know what happens next. You either break or you find something inside yourself you didn't know existed. I walked to the window. Boston's skyline glittered in the winter darkness, a million lights twinkling like false promises. Somewhere out there, my son slept in a house controlled by a man who'd tried to kill him, and I had exactly no one left willing to help me stop it. Fine, I thought. Then I'll do it myself. For 3 days after Eleanor's visit, I did nothing but go through the motions. I made Ethan breakfast with them hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. I watched him play with his toys, his laughter echoing in rooms that felt hollow and cold. I smiled when he showed me his drawings, hugged him when he asked for comfort, read him bedtime stories with a voice that sounded almost normal. But inside, I was drowning. Derek came and went with his usual lies and absences, more confident now than ever. He'd heard through his mother's network that the investigation had collapsed, that my father had been neutralized, that I was alone and defenseless. He looked at me with barely concealed triumph, the cat who'd finally cornered the mouse. At night, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat in the darkness of my bedroom and stared at nothing. The evidence we'd gathered was locked in my father's study photographs, documents, medical records that proved everything. But without lawyers willing to touch it, without investigators to verify it, without a prosecutor brave enough to file charges, it was just paper. Expensive, damning, useless paper. On the third night, I found myself standing in front of the bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning. The woman who stared back at me was someone I barely recognized. Hollow eyes, pale skin, the face of defeat. "Is this who you are?" I asked her silently. "Is this how the story ends?" Then something shifted. Maybe it was the memory of Ethan's face turning blue on Christmas Eve. Maybe it was the thought of Derek winning, taking my son, spending my grandmother's money, walking away to destroy another woman after me. Maybe it was simply that I'd reached the bottom and there was nowhere left to fall. I remembered who I used to be, before Derek convinced me to quit my career, before I became just a stay-at-home mom, before I let a charming man with expensive suits and practiced smiles convince me that I was fragile and incompetent and needed him to function. I was Carolyn Ashford, RN, pediatric nurse for 6 years at one of the best hospitals in the country, the woman who'd caught a medication error that would have killed a 3-year-old patient, the woman who'd testified in a malpractice case against a negligent physician and watched him lose his license, the woman who'd been recruited for a charge nurse position before Derek persuaded her that Ethan needed a full-time mother more than the world needed another nurse. I still had skills. I still had training. I still had a brain that could analyze medical records and spot inconsistencies that others missed. And I still had access to information Eleanor Mercer had overlooked. The next morning, I filed a formal request for Ethan's complete medical records. As his mother and legal guardian, I had absolute right to every document related to his care. No lawyer required, no investigator needed, just a signature and a form. By afternoon, I was sitting in a coffee shop 3 miles from our house, spreading 2 years of charts and notes across a corner table. My nursing training came back like muscle memory. I knew how to read physician notes, how to interpret lab values, how to spot patterns in medication administration records. I knew what questions to ask and where inconsistencies might hide. And I found them. Dr. Catherine Pierce, Ethan's allergist at Boston General, had flagged several entries with handwritten annotations in the margins. Medication batch inconsistency noted, recommend pharmacy review. Pattern of suboptimal response discussed with family regarding storage protocols. A third incident in 4 months escalate to administration. Someone at the hospital had noticed something wrong. Someone had tried to raise alarms. Someone had been ignored or silenced. I found Dr. Pierce's personal number through a nursing school friend who still worked at Boston General. My hands shook as I dialed. "Mrs. Mercer." Dr. Pierce's voice was cautious, guarded. "I'm not sure I should be speaking with you outside official channels. Please, Dr. Pierce, I need to understand what you noticed about my son's medications. I'm not asking you to violate any protocols. I'm asking you to help me protect my child." A long pause. I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, weighing risk against conscience. "I could lose my job for this," she said finally. "I could lose my son." Another silence. Then a heavy sigh. "There's a coffee shop on Tremont Street, near the Common, tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., before my shift starts. Come alone." So Pierce arrived looking exhausted but resolved. She was younger than I expected, mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, the kind of quiet competence I recognized from my own years in the profession. She slid into the booth across from me, glanced around to ensure no one was watching, and pushed a thick folder across the table. "I flagged those records because the lot numbers didn't match," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every medication has a batch number that can be traced through the pharmacy system. Ethan's EpiPens should have come from specific lots that I could verify through our records. But they didn't. The medications actually used during his reactions had different lot numbers. Some were from batches that had expired months earlier. Some were from lots that were never distributed to your pharmacy at all." She shook her head. "Someone was deliberately switching his emergency medication with compromised supplies. And you reported this." Her laugh was bitter, exhausted. "I filed 3 separate concerns with hospital administration over 4 months. Each time I was told the inconsistencies were clerical errors, documentation mistakes, nothing to worry about. What changed? The third time, the administrator, a woman named Patricia Holloway who sits on Eleanor Mercer's charity board, called me into her office. She told me very politely that if I continued making unfounded accusations against valued hospital partners, I would face disciplinary action, that my concerns were creating a hostile environment, and that perhaps I wasn't suited for a position requiring such delicate judgment. Dr. Pierce's hands tightened around her coffee cup. I have a daughter starting college next year, a mortgage, parents who depend on me. I couldn't afford to lose everything over the suspicions I couldn't prove. She met my eyes. But I kept copies. Everything I documented, every flagged record, every incident report, every email I sent to administration. I've been waiting for someone brave enough to use them. I'm not brave, I told her. I'm desperate. Sometimes that's the same thing. That same week, I tracked down Detective Margaret Sullivan. She'd retired 3 years ago from the Boston Police Department, but her name appeared repeatedly in Rachel Montgomery's files, the same files Rachel had abandoned when Eleanor's threats became too real. Maggie Sullivan had been the original investigator on the Mercer Holdings case, the one my father had been forced to dismiss 15 years ago. I found her tending roses in the backyard of a modest 3-decker in Dorchester. She was smaller than I expected, compact, gray-haired, with weathered hands that moved confidently among the thorns. Detective Sullivan. She didn't look up from her pruning. I wondered when someone would come asking about the Mercers again. Took longer than I expected. You investigated them 15 years ago. Investigated is generous. She snipped a dead branch, examined it, tossed it aside. I started investigating. Then the case was dismissed for insufficient evidence, and I was strongly encouraged to find other professional interests. But you didn't forget. Cops don't forget cases that got away, the ones that haunt you. She finally looked at me, sharp eyes and a weathered face, the gaze of a woman who'd seen every variety of human darkness. You're the judge's daughter, the one Derek married. You know who I am. I've kept tabs on that family ever since they walked away clean, which means I know exactly what's been happening to your little ball. She set down her pruning shears. Come inside. I have something to show you. Her basement was a detective's shrine to an unsolved obsession. Filing cabinets lined every wall, boxes of documents stacked in neat rows, a corkboard covered with photographs, news clippings, and red string connecting names and dates. 15 years of evidence, obsessively collected and meticulously preserved. Financial irregularities going back decades. Witness statements that were never followed up because witnesses suddenly couldn't remember anything. Evidence of systematic intimidation against anyone who challenged the family. She pulled open a drawer stuffed with folders. And this, a photograph of a woman, mom, dark-haired, beautiful. Haunted eyes that looked directly into the camera with an expression I recognized, the look of someone who'd survived something terrible and lived in fear it would find her again. Natalie Crawford, Derek's first victim. She's been hiding in Seattle for 6 years, living under a different name, looking over her shoulder every single day. Maggie smiled grimly. But I found her last month, and she's finally ready to talk. For the first time since Eleanor's visit, I felt something other than despair. I had a doctor who could testify about medical evidence, a retired detective with 15 years of documentation, and possibly another victim willing to establish the pattern that would prove Derek was a serial predator, not a husband who'd made a single mistake. No expensive lawyers, no powerful connections, no institutional support, just 3 women who refused to be silenced. Welcome to the resistance, Mrs. Mercer, Maggie said. We're small, but we're stubborn, and we don't know how to quit. The flight to Seattle felt like traveling to another world. I'd never been to the Pacific Northwest before. As the plane descended through layers of gray clouds, I watched the city emerge below green hills, silver water, a skyline that seemed smaller and gentler than Boston's aggressive towers. A place where someone might disappear, a place where someone might try to forget. Natalie Crawford had been hiding here for 6 years. Her apartment building in Capitol Hill was modest red brick, 4 stories, the kind of place where working professionals lived before they could afford houses. I stood outside for 10 minutes before finding the courage to press her buzzer. What if she refused to see me? What if she'd spent 6 years building walls I couldn't break through? What if Eleanor's threats still held power over her? Even across 3,000 miles, she answered on the third ring. "You're Caroline," she said through the intercom. Her voice was flat, guarded. "Maggie called, said you'd be coming. I know I'm asking a lot. I know you have every reason to say no." Third floor, apartment B. The door buzzed open. Natalie's apartment was sparse but clean, the home of someone who'd learned to need very little, to leave no traces, to be ready to run again if necessary. Minimal furniture, no photographs on the walls, nothing personal that might anchor her to a place or a life. She was smaller than she'd looked in the photograph, fragile in a way that made my chest ache with recognition. But her eyes dark, wary, intelligent, held a fierce determination that hadn't been captured in any picture. She made tea in a tiny kitchen while I waited in her living room, trying to find words for what I'd come to ask. When she returned, she sat across from me in a worn armchair and waited. "I met Derek at a charity gala in Boston," she said finally, not waiting for my questions. "The Children's Hospital fundraiser. He was charming, attentive, everything I thought I wanted in a man. Within 6 months, we were engaged. Within a year, I'd lost $340,000. How did it happen? Investment opportunities he recommended, companies that existed only on paper. By the time I realized what was happening, by the time I stopped believing his explanations and excuses, the money was gone." Her hands tightened around her mug. When I confronted him, he changed. Like someone had flipped a switch inside him. Changed how? The charm disappeared. The warmth. Everything that had made me fall in love with him. Natalie stared into her tea. Suddenly I was crazy, paranoid, having a mental breakdown. He told everyone, our friends, my family, anyone who would listen, that I was unstable, that I'd imagined things, that he was the victim of my delusions. The pattern was so familiar it made me sick. "What happened when you went to the police?" "Eleanor happened." Natalie's voice hardened. "My brother had a small construction business. Within a month of my first police report, he lost 3 major contracts, all connected to companies Eleanor influenced. Then his insurance was canceled without explanation. His suppliers stopped returning calls. His employees started getting job offers from competitors. She destroyed him to punish you. She didn't have to threaten me directly. She didn't have to say a single word to my face." Natalie finally met my eyes. I got the message. I dropped the charges, packed what I could carry, and disappeared. New city, new name, new life built on the ashes of everything I'd lost. "But you kept evidence." Emails where Derek admits to borrowing my money. Screenshots of texts where he promises to pay it back. Financial records I'd hidden before everything fell apart. She set down her teacup. "I've been waiting 7 years for someone strong enough to fight back. Someone the Mercers couldn't destroy. I don't know if I'm that person," I admitted. "I've lost everything too. My lawyers, my investigators. My father's been neutralized. I'm doing this alone." "That's exactly why you might succeed." Natalie leaned forward. "They're not expecting someone with nothing left to lose. Someone too desperate to be afraid." She paused. "Someone fighting for her child. Will you help me? Will you testify?" The silence stretched between us. I could see the fear in her eyes. 6 years of hiding. 6 years of looking over her shoulder. 6 years of wondering when Eleanor would find her again. "Yes," she said finally. "God help me. Yes. If there's any chance of stopping him before he does this to someone else, to some other woman's child, then yes." My next stop was the most dangerous. Vanessa Thornton, Derek's mistress, lived in a Back Bay penthouse funded by money stolen from my family. She was the enemy. The other woman. The person who'd helped Derek forge documents and hide assets. I expected her to slam the door in my face, to call security, to alert Derek that his wife had come looking for revenge. Instead, she invited me in. Her apartment was beautiful but cold, designer furniture. Expensive art, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Charles River. A showroom, not a home. The kind of place where someone lived when they were trying to fill an emptiness that couldn't be filled with things. I know why you're here, Vanessa said, gesturing for me to sit on a white leather sofa. And you're right, about everything. Then why did you help him? Vanessa laughed a bitter, hollow sound. Because I believed every word he said. He told me you were cold and unloving, that you'd trapped him with a pregnancy, that he stayed in the marriage for Ethan's sake, but the relationship was dead. She walked to the window, staring out at the city. I thought I was the love of his life, his soulmate, the woman he'd been waiting for. What changed when she turned around? I saw tears on her carefully made-up face. I found out he was sleeping with my sister, my 22-year-old baby sister, who looked up to me, who trusted me, who only met Derek because I introduced them at Thanksgiving dinner. Her voice cracked. He told both of us we were the only one, scheduled us on alternating days like business appointments, made each of us feel special while he used us both. The parallel to my own betrayal was staggering. Derek didn't just destroy marriages. He destroyed families, sisters, every relationship he touched. He's a predator, I said quietly. It's not about love. It's about power, about proving he can take whatever he wants. I know that now. Vanessa walked to a desk in the corner and retrieved a manila folder. I helped him with some of these, forging your signature on documents, creating paper trails to hide money transfers. I'm not proud of what I did. I told myself it didn't matter because the marriage was already over. She handed me the folder. Inside were documents I'd never seen, forged trust fund transfers with Derek's fingerprints, financial statements in his handwriting, authorization letters I'd never signed. This is enough to prove fraud, I said, my heart racing. I know. That's why I kept copies. Well, Vanessa sat down across from me, her expression hardening. What he did to me, I could almost forgive. I was stupid. I let myself be fooled. But my sister, she was innocent. She trusted me, and I brought a monster into her life. Will you testify in court, on record, knowing what the Mercers will do to you, for what he did to my sister? Vanessa's eyes were cold as winter. I'd testify in front of God himself. With Vanessa's evidence and testimony combined with Natalie's, we finally had enough for federal charges. Wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy, crimes that couldn't be buried by local connections or intimidated witnesses. But we needed a prosecutor willing to take on the Mercer empire. Maggie Sullivan made one phone call. Federal prosecutor Margaret Foster had built her career on bringing down powerful families who believed themselves untouchable. For 18 years, she'd been waiting for a case against Mercer Holdings, watching from the sidelines as evidence disappeared. Witnesses recanted, and investigations collapsed. When I laid our evidence on her desk, the medical records, the financial documentation, Natalie's testimony, Vanessa's confession, Maggie's 15-year file, she spent 3 hours reviewing every page in silence. Finally, she looked up. Ms. Ashford, I've been waiting a very long time for someone brave enough to bring me something I can actually use against that family. It's not about being brave, I said. It's about protecting my son. That's exactly what brave looks like. She smiled cold, predatory, satisfied. Let's talk about how we're going to dismantle an empire. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but justice is best served in a federal courtroom with cameras rolling and nowhere to hide. If you've ever been wronged by someone who thought money made them untouchable, keep listening, because today, the untouchable gets touched. The federal courthouse in Boston was built to intimidate. Marble columns, vaulted ceilings, the weight of law pressing down from every surface. Derek arrived in his best suit, lawyer at his side, confidence radiating from every pore. He'd been told this was an emergency custody hearing, a formality. His attorney assured him Carolyn was simply being dramatic. He didn't notice the FBI agents stationed at every exit. All rise. The Honorable Judge Patricia Winters presiding. Judge Winters was 73 years old and had never been intimidated by anyone in her life. She surveyed the courtroom with sharp eyes that missed nothing. We are here today to address multiple federal charges against Derek Harrison Mercer, wire fraud, forgery, conspiracy to commit financial crimes, endangerment of a minor. She looked directly at Derek. How do you plead? Derek's smile faltered. I'm sorry, what charges? This was supposed to be a custody hearing. Your attorney received the federal indictment 3 days ago. Mr. Mercer, if he failed to inform you, that's between you and him. Derek turned to his lawyer, whose face had gone gray. Prosecutor Foster rose. Your Honor, the government will present evidence that Derek Mercer systematically defrauded his wife of over $800,000, forged her signature on federal loan documents, and deliberately endangered their minor child to build a false case for custody. The evidence was presented methodically. Bank records traced by Thomas Bennett's former analysis, forged documents with Derek's fingerprints, verified by FBI experts, medical records showing the pattern of sabotaged medications. Then the witnesses. Dr. Catherine Pierce took the stand. The lot numbers on Ethan Mercer's EpiPens were inconsistent with pharmacy records. Someone deliberately switched his life-saving medication with compromised supplies. The pattern escalated over 8 months. Natalie Crawford testified next. Her voice shook, but she didn't waver. He did the same thing to me. The charm, the manipulation, the theft. It's what he does. It's who he is. Finally, Vanessa Thornton. He asked me to help forge Caroline's signature on trust fund documents. He said it was just temporary, that they were getting divorced anyway. She looked at Derek with pure hatred. He told me I was the only woman he'd ever loved, while he was sleeping with my sister in the same apartment building. With each witness, Derek's confidence crumbled. His lawyer whispered frantically. The corporate attorney from Mercer Holdings, who'd accompanied him, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, Mercer Holdings wishes to state for the record that we are terminating all association with Derek Mercer, effective immediately. The company had no knowledge of his personal activities. Derek spun around. What are you doing? Call my mother. Your mother is currently unavailable. Mr. Mercer. The courtroom doors opened. Eleanor Mercer was led in by 2 FBI agents, hands cuffed in front of her designer suit. Eleanor Mercer, Judge Winters announced, you are also named in federal indictments for wire fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. 15 years of criminal activity uncovered by evidence provided by Detective Margaret Sullivan. Maggie stood in the gallery, arms crossed, satisfaction written across her weathered face. 15 years of patience, finally vindicated. Derek lunged from his seat. This is a setup. Caroline planned all of this. She's trying to steal my son and my money. Mr. Mercer, control yourself or you will be restrained. The bailiffs moved closer as Derek spiraled. I want to make a statement, I said, rising from my seat. Judge Winters nodded. I approached the front of the courtroom. Derek was being held back by bailiffs, his face contorted with rage. You thought I was weak, I said quietly. You thought I was stupid. You married me because my father was powerful and my grandmother left money. You spent 3 years trying to destroy me. You tried to kill our son. I never, Joe. You switched his medicine. You sent peanut cookies to our home. You wanted him hospitalized so you could call me an unfit mother and take everything. My voice didn't shake. You almost succeeded, but you forgot something. I stepped closer. I'm not the naive woman you married. I'm not the broken wife you created. I'm the mother of a child you tried to harm. And there is nothing more dangerous in this world than that. Derek was led away in handcuffs, still screaming about conspiracies and lies. Eleanor followed, silent and pale. In the gallery, my father wept. Dr. Pierce sat beside Natalie Crawford, holding her hand. Maggie Sullivan nodded at me, one warrior acknowledging another. We had won. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of Boston Children's Hospital, watching Ethan cut a red ribbon with oversized scissors. The Ashford Pediatric Allergy Center. He read slowly from the plaque. That's Grandpa's name, and someday it'll be your name too. I told him the center was funded by the settlement from Mercer Holdings, money recovered by federal prosecutor Foster's relentless investigation. It would provide free EpiPens and allergy testing to families who couldn't afford them. It would train medical staff to recognize signs of medication tampering. It would save lives. Ethan ran off to explore the new facility with his grandfather while I stayed behind, watching the crowd of supporters file in. Dr. Catherine Pierce was there, now heading the hospital's patient safety committee. She'd been promoted after her testimony, recognized as a whistleblower rather than punished as a troublemaker. Natalie Crawford had flown in from Seattle. She'd rebuilt her life, started a nonprofit helping financial abuse survivors, and finally stopped looking over her shoulder. Even Vanessa Thornton sent flowers. She'd received immunity for her testimony and disappeared into obscurity somewhere in California. Last I heard, she'd opened a small bakery and hadn't spoken to her sister since the trial. Detective Maggie Sullivan stood by the window, still sharp-eyed at 68. "You did good, kid," she said as I joined her. "We did good. 18 years I worked that case. 18 years of dead ends and buried evidence." She smiled. "Sometimes justice takes time. Doesn't mean it's not coming." Derek was serving 18 years in federal prison. No parole eligibility for 12. His assets had been seized, his reputation destroyed, his name synonymous with fraud and abuse. Eleanor received 12 years. Mercer Holdings was under federal oversight. Its board replaced, its criminal enterprises dismantled. Piece by piece, the dynasty that had terrorized Boston for generations was finally, irrevocably broken. That afternoon, I visited my mother's grave for the first time since everything began. The cemetery was quiet, winter sun filtering through bare branches. I laid flowers against her headstone and sat in the cold grass. "I wish you could see him. Mom, he's so brave." I traced her name with my fingertip. "I wish you could see me too. I finally found out who I am when everything was stripped away." I sat there until the sun began to set, talking to her about everything and nothing. The woman I'd been, the woman I'd become, the future I was building from the wreckage of my past. That evening, I made dinner in our new apartment. It was small compared to the Mercer estate, 2 bedrooms, a galley kitchen, a view of a parking lot. I loved every inch of it. "Mommy?" Ethan looked up from his coloring book. "Do bad people always get caught?" I set down the spatula and knelt beside him. "Not always, baby. The world isn't always fair. Sometimes bad people get away with things they shouldn't." I tucked a strand of hair behind his ear. "But good people never stop trying to make things right. That's what matters. Not whether we always win, but that we never stop fighting." He considered this with 6-year-old solemnity. "Like you did, like we all did. Me and Grandpa and Dr. Pierce and lots of other brave people." I kissed his forehead. "You were brave too. You know, the bravest." "I know," he said matter-of-factly, and returned to coloring. That night, after stories and songs and checking his EpiPen habit now, always would be, I stood in his doorway watching him breathe. Easy, steady, safe. Some endings aren't happy. The fairy tale version would have Derek never existing at all, would have my mother alive to see her grandson thrive, would have erased the scars we both carried. But this was real life. And in real life, victory isn't the absence of pain. It's proving that pain didn't destroy you. I turned off the light and walked to the window. Boston glittered in the darkness. 1,000 stories unfolding behind 1,000 windows. Some were tragedies, some were triumphs. Mine was both. Tomorrow, I would return to nursing, pediatric patient advocacy, helping families navigate systems that failed them, catching predators that hid behind charm and money, being the person I wish had existed when I needed her most. Tonight, I stood in my small apartment, listening to my son breathe, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness exactly. Not forgetting. Just peace. The quiet certainty that I had faced the worst life could offer and survived. That I had protected my child against a monster who wore a wedding ring. That I had found strength I never knew I possessed. The woman Derek Mercer married was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, someone fiercer, someone who would never be underestimated again. My name is Caroline Ashford, and this is how I won.